Hi, Misha here, and still on vacation, but this was a video I thought would be kind of fun to do for a while. Nothing exactly earth-shattering, but let's kind of look at the interim generation of Walther pistols. You might almost think of this as a lost generation. But if you look at the modern PPQ, and then look at the P38, they're worlds apart, and this kind of bridges that. So we're going to look at the P4, which is quite obviously a P38 derivative, but then the P5 and P5 compact, which aesthetically, cosmetically look very different, but internally are virtually the same. And then the P88 and P88C, which are actually the first to use a whole different system. And then how that bleeds over into the first generation of P99 and P99 compact, which are in a lot of ways P88s, but with polymer frames. So, yeah, let's just go ahead and dive on in. The P1 used by the Bundeswehr and its P38 analog used by police and commercially sold really was just a World War II P38, but with an alloy frame. And it did introduce a few updates, but many of them actually started with the P4 here. Now in the 1970s, West Germany realized that its police officers needed a more powerful gun than .32. And a lot of companies were racing to, introduce guns to designs. And this was always meant to be a stopgap solution. Introduced in 1974, the P4 here had about a half-inch shorter barrel than a P.1 P.38. If you look, I can just knock you over. I miss having a cameraman too, trust me. So a little bit shorter, a little bit lighter. But they didn't stop there. They went to kind of a single piece top, which meant the rear sight was attached differently, and no loaded chamber indicator sticking out the back. They also went to a decocker only versus the standard safety decocker. This was actually borrowed from the PP Super, and it's not just a decocker only, it also has a brand new firing pin safety that moves the firing pin out of notch there. Has a little hole for it to fit into, meaning it's safe to carry. They bobbed the hammer a bit. And actually, the P4 was the first to introduce the new kind of larger dot front sight and the hex pin in the alloy frame to strengthen it. Features that would later appear on the P1. But it used the same grip, same 8-round mags. Disassembly was the same. Two recoil springs for a very greasy gun. And our usual wedge system here, borrowed from the P38, because that's what this was. Essentially just a P38. but it got the job done until something more could come along. Here's our decocker only. For the firing pin here. It only moves into position when the trigger is pulled. The trigger on these, by the way, was ribbed for a better grip. And between 1974 and 1981, Walther would produce about 8,000 of these. About 7,500 were for police markets, and 500 were sold as the P38 for the civilian market. And of the 7,500 P4s made, about 6,500 were sold to West German police, with the balance either being sold off as surplus to needs or to other small police outside of Germany and in Europe. And of course, there was an even shorter version, first introduced a year later, known as the P38K, but we've already looked at that in another video. So let's move on to what Walther had been working on while the P4 was on the market. The P5. This was introduced for the upcoming German police trials in 1978, and would be accepted along with the HK P7 and the Sig Sauer P5, excuse me, the P6, aka the P225. And so those three were approved for purchase, and West German police could purchase whichever one of the three they felt was best. And these were also sold to a few other police departments in Europe. And Walther had a lot better success with these. At least 40,000 were sold to police, plus thousands more on the commercial market. And this probably looks like a very different gun. Interestingly, it ejects from the left. We have a fully enclosed slide now. Adjustable sights, kind of a very similar dot front sight. Rounded trigger guard. Cock it back. We have an interesting multi-control here. Press it once to release the slide, and a second time to decock. So it's a decocker only. And that's really our only control. 8-round magazine. And if you notice, it's very similar to the P38 P1 mag. In fact, the only difference, the mag catch is kind of buried in the grip here to protect it. And there's a small notch there cut into the standard mag, meaning that P5 mags will work in a P4 or P38, but not vice versa, at least not without modification. Bobbed hammer. Yeah. But the fact is, this is just a modernized P38. It uses the same falling wedge system, same small dual recoil rods, and the trigger and safety system, double action, single action, is essentially borrowed from the P4. Even the safety decocker and all that is just an updated version, as are the mags. They also ribbed the front of the grip. And the trigger guard for better grip is still an alloy frame, steel slide. And they would build these through the 1980s. But it would be not replaced, but joined by this gun, the P5C P5 Compact. Now the difference is not huge. Put them together here so you can see. Overall, the P5 is about 7.1 inches. The P5C is about 6.7. The P5 has about a 3.5 inch barrel, and the P5C has a 3.1 inch. So the difference is essentially in the barrel. They both have the same size grip with 8-round mag. They even weigh very similar. The P5 is 28 ounces, the P5C 26. So what's the big deal? Why even mess with the P5C? Kind of wondered the same thing until I got one. Mechanically, we're about the same. Control. Now, interestingly, we do have a Browning style mag release. Its mags can still work in a P38. They even have the notch in the back for the P5. But now we have yet another notch over here. Notice it's only on one side, not two, for these. Now, I know that some of the earliest P5 compacts actually still had the heel-mounted release, too. Same sights. We have a more bobbed hammer. Let me pull it back so you can see a little better. So what they really did, it wasn't a size and weight thing. It was a rounding thing. Notice the barrel doesn't stick out. This is much more rounded in the front. Much more rounded trigger guard. Still has some serrations for your offhand, though. More rounded top of the slide here. And kind of most interesting to me, a more rounded off grip. Even though the grip is the same, it looks shorter because of how they scalloped the bottom. The mag sticks out more, and we don't have a mag catch down there. See, this is very square. And just to prove to you, this still looks like a P38. By the way, the takedown's a little different shape than earlier gun. Look familiar? See, it really is the same. And here, still have the falling wedge lock. Little 3-inch barrel. So even though the slide is more enclosed, and there's no longer safety on it, you can see it's really just a P38 modernized. Now the P5 saw the most success with West German police and a few others. The P5C is probably most famous for its use by the British, especially in, sorry guys, I have to do it properly here. Usually works a lot better when you do things the right way. Like I said, in Northern Ireland. In Britain, about 3,000 were purchased from Carl Walther, designated as the L102A1. 102A1. That's probably the largest single contract for these, because this is very much an interim solution, much like the P4 here was just a shortened P1 P38 until the P5 came along. The P5 compact here was introduced in 1987 as an interim solution until the next gun came along, and therefore it was only produced for a few years. And it's pretty uncommon today. Boy, it ejects with a lot of force on this one. Good old Browning style release. It's a very smooth gun. It does feel good in the hand. Again, on paper, it doesn't seem that small or light, but they were smart about how they reshaped the P5C. It does feel very good and feels very modern, but it came out in the 1980s, also known as the time of the Walther 9s, and Walther wanted to get in on that. The P5C was just to have something to release until the gun that was supposed to revitalize Walther's handgun market came online. The famous and sometimes infamous P88. The progenitor of this gun was actually designed and entered into America's XM9 trials. Yes, the trials that gave us the Sig Sauer P226 and of course the Beretta 92F that became the M9. And so it was originally designed to kind of meet all those requirements, including capacity, weight, size, accuracy. But it very quickly was crossed off. It did not pass the drop test. And to be fair, the Beretta was already a production gun. Sure, they updated it for the trials. And yeah, the 226 was new, but it was based on the tried and true 220 series, like the P6, the 225. This design was new. At least, as new as a handgun can be. So while it didn't meet with success in the XM9 trials, Walther continued developing it and was pretty much ready in 1987. Sources disagree if it was actually first released in 87 or if it wasn't released till 88 but just kind of showcased in 87. But this was one of the new Wonder 9s. So what is this gun? Well, of course it is a double single action. It has what's pretty common today, a 15-round mag, but was pretty cutting edge for that time. One neat feature, even though you'll note there's only a cutout on the right side here, it actually has a true ambidextrous tag release. Button here, and you can press either side. It's the same button, you're just pressing it in. So that's pretty neat. It also has an ambidextrous multi-control, like the P5 P.4. Press it once, slide, press it a second time, decock. Pretty bobbed hammer. We have a very similar takedown here to what we had earlier. We'll take it apart in just a minute. Fun fact, there's also another little control that a lot of people may not realize is here, right here. And this is a manual hold open if you don't have a mag gun. Obviously with no mag, you can't hold it back, but if you hold this control, you can lock it open. Let's do that to release. This had regular sights, little trough, alloy frame, has a 4-inch barrel. Overall length is about 7.1 inches, so about the same overall length as the P5C. A little longer, but kind of in that same category, but we have a longer barrel. Alloy frame, so it's quite lightweight. It's under 32 ounces unloaded. Polymer grip panels, pretty ergonomic grip, curvy, and lanyard loop on the bottom. So what makes this so different? As you saw, for one thing, you don't have to have the slide back for disassembly. Here's our guts. And you'll notice there is no spring set in here. Double spring, like on all the previous guns. Instead, we have what looks to be a very conventional mainspring under the barrel with a guide rod. And this time the barrel comes out a very conventional way. And that's because this is using a simplified, modified Browning tipping or tilting barrel lock breech system. So much like Glock or anyone else. We still have the firing pin safety, first used in the PP Super, carried over through the P4 and P5. Notice we still have the hole in the hammer here for it to rest in securely for very safe carry. And above all, this weapon is known for exceptional accuracy for a production military police grade sidearm at least. So we have high enough capacity for the 80s, 15 rounds. We have a, at the time, very modern lightweight alloy frame, modern synthetic grips, truly ambidextrous controls. These even had different sights you could adjust in to dial it in, taller or shorter rear sights. It's worth pointing out that the initial year of production for these were a little different. The front sight was dovetailed in a different way, and the whole slide was made a little differently. So first year production guns do look a little different. These were reliable too. So why wasn't the P88 a runaway success for Carl Walther? Two reasons. One, you probably know very well. Cost. Even for a German-made gun, these were expensive, even on a police or military budget, even compared to like a SIG. Part of it was the fine engineering that went into them. Part of it was the simple R&D costs that Walther had accrued throughout the whole XM9 thing that didn't work out. But another part was the fact that Walther was an Asian company, not Asian, but aging company that was still trying to kind of make these with 1950s technology, which is probably why they were so finely made. Very smooth and accurate, very good triggers. But a lot of hand fitting went into these. By the 80s, CNC equipment was starting to be used. In fact, Sig Sauer pioneered CNC tooling for the P220 series. Things were changing. And of course, Glock, by this time, 1988, 1989, had brought in polymer frames. So how is an alloy frame, all metal gun, going to compete with that? They were exceptionally expensive. And on top of that, they weren't the most durable. This rear sight actually was one of the things that disqualified it from the XM9 trials. And while the production model was better, it was always a bit of a weak point. These grips also can crack. They're a little thin. I've seen at least 2 guns with cracked grips. But probably the killer, there are a few places in this frame, especially around here, that are a little thin in the alloy and that can crack and or chip away. And I've seen at least one gun. Also down here, it can happen. So when your alloy frame is breaking away, because in a few places it's simply too thin, that's no bueno. I'm not saying every P88 does that, but that combined with the cost of the gun minimized its success. And also, it has to be said, these were produced between 1988 and 1994. It's said around 10,000 are made. It's just a rough estimate. But it was almost always a prototype or pre-production. They made running changes throughout the years, and they never really settled on the design. It was always kind of a little bit of a work in progress, especially the first 3-4 years. Maybe by 93, 94 it was kind of settled into. But by then, it suffered another major misfortune. One of the best markets Walther had found for the P88 was, of course, in the USA, on the civilian shooter market. Or as a police department, even a small one, looking to buy 10 or 20 of these would be overwhelmed by the cost. An individual shooter, buy once, cry once type mentality, may not be. So they were selling these. Slow, but steady. But then, as you know, in September of 1994, the federal assault weapons ban came in. Bum, bum, bum. Meaning this 15-round mag had to be reduced to 10. And that on top of the cost doomed this pistol. It was just one thing too many. And because sales had already been poor, and because Walther was starting to suffer some company issues, some ownership and financial issues, at the end of the year, P88 production was halted, although of course they sold off existing guns in inventory for some time afterwards, even with dorky 10-round mags. But it wasn't quite the end of the series. You know the pattern by now. It's time for a compact. Now, the P4 and the P5C were interim solutions, but good guns in and of themselves, and refinements on their parent gun. Well, the P88 compact, P88C, a little different. It wasn't much lighter, at about 29 ounces. And it wasn't much shorter, at about 6.8 inches long, and it had a 3.8 inch barrel, so not even quite a 1/4 inch difference. And if you look at it, compare it here to the full-size P88, you'll notice the C seems a little more squared off, I think you'll agree. And the controls are a little different. If this does not seem like a product improvement on the P88, you are right, sir. This was primarily designed to be cheaper. Although that doesn't mean it's a bad gun. We still retained the ambidextrous mag catch, same exact mechanism. The standard mag was 14 rounds, although most in America were shipped with 10-round mags. So the grip was only slightly shorter. So the lanyard loop down here. But you'll notice there's no multi-control on this side. Now we do have a slide release here. But that's all it does. Now we have, I guess we'll call it a Beretta style safety, although I guess you could also call it a P38 style, but it is on both sides. And if you notice, it acts as a true decocker safety, staying down. It's a far simpler mechanism. And we are going away from the firing pin block we've been using. Now we're going to a more simple mechanical block that just comes up and moves the safety, the firing pin up. Still an effective design, but I don't know, kind of a little less cool way of doing it. That's so the lock work is simplified. Of course, it's a more blocky slide, easier to machine. Still has an alloy frame. Still need to have it here. Look inside here. And here. We've gone to a new braided spring and a slightly thinner recoil rod, guide rod. And here's our barrel. I kind of flared the end out here to try to achieve a little tighter lockup. Try to preserve some of that P88 accuracy. And it doesn't move in the muzzle there. But yeah, this was mostly introduced to be cheaper. And it was. It's hard to compare costs because different places. The problem, it wasn't cheaper enough. It was still a pretty expensive little gun. And this was still the time of the assault weapons ban. So even if it was better, sorry guys, it's not gonna take apart a lot. And I'm not used to doing it this angle. I'll be right back. This is literally 2 seconds later, as soon as I got it at the right angle. Anyway, it's late, I'm tired, so oh well. So they introduced this around 1992. And people saw it for what it was. Not cheaper, P88. Although, I think it may be a little more durable. You don't hear of the frame issues with the P88C. And you definitely find more of these in the USA than the P88 full size. Mags do stick out, but they fit. That kind of shows you how much shorter the grip is. Holds open too. So weird not having that standard decocker. And P88 compact manufacturing wouldn't last much more than with the P88. By 96, it was over. In fact, the Walther company was more or less over at this time. But it wouldn't stay down for very long. And so now we get to the beginning of kind of the modern age of Walthers with the P99. Walther had been a family-owned business. but it was essentially bought out and restructured. And around 94, work began on this gun. And they brought in some pretty good talent. They brought in Horst Wesp, formerly of Glock, to design the gun, and Cesar Maringini, an Olympic shooter and winner, to design the grip specifically. Now, a lot of people are aware that P99 exists, but I don't know that many realize, okay, Glock started the polymer-framed gun thing, but the P99 really moved it forward. Introduced in 1997, some places say 96, it has a much more ergonomic grip, at least for most people, myself included, compared to the Walther. Excuse me, compared to the Glock. So just late. And it, unlike the Glock, has interchangeable back straps. A very common feature today. Back then, it was really the first, and it would ship with 3. Small, medium, and large. So it is a very ergonomic gun. Has a serrated front to the trigger guard. Had a proprietary rail. But back then, everyone did, so it wasn't anything huge and new. Like the P88 before it, it had a 4-inch barrel as standard. But since we're now a polymer frame, the weight drops to about 22-23 ounces. And we have this so-called German style paddle mag release that I really love. I still think it's a great solution because unlike all these Browning styles that are on modern guns today where you have to swap it around, this gives you either side, and once you train yourself to use it, it's very usable. And the mags from these, this is the Gen 1, these are 16 round, are very similar to the P88 mags, just with a modern base plate. I mean, they're different, but the geometry and everything, pretty much the same. Of course, Metgar by this point is making mags for virtually everyone, Walther included. So takedown is via these levers here, which I think is an improvement on Glocks. Another thing that I think is an improvement on Glocks is the trigger system that the P99 introduced. It's a simulated double single action, and it's still a striker fired gun. So it's the first of these to be a striker, not a hammer. But it has a double action pull, or it has a single action. Now it has a stage trigger here. Pull it back, and then as it cycles, it'll stay in the rear position for a single action style. You can also have it double and then do just a tiny cock to be single, or you can have single and it has a decocker to go back to double. I just think that's pretty neat. It's also neat that for this assembly, you can use the decocker if your striker has tension on it. Here it is. The trigger system. And here's our recoil guide. Notice it's completely captive now. Polymer rod. Here's our 4-inch barrel. And typical insides. The 9mm slides are scalloped in the front. But because Interims was the first importer, but Smith & Wesson finally took them over very early on. After doing these in by 19, they would soon do 40 caliber Smith & Wesson versions, and for extra mass, they would not scallop the slide. Just a small little difference worth pointing out. A very slick, very ergonomic design, and most importantly for the market, much cheaper than the P88 or even P88 Compact. These were a little pricier than Glocks, but not significantly so. The main problem was distribution. Glocks were simply easier to find, but you know, sometimes something harder to get isn't a bad thing. Plus, they were featured in James Bond films. I think Tomorrow Never Dies was the first one it was in, but I could be wrong. I know it was in the Pierce Brosnan era. The earliest generations had a trigger dingus like a Glock, but very soon they would go to a different style of trigger safety. And like a Glock, all the safeties here are internal, unless you consider the decocker. This one here is the Army Edition. Really, it's just green frame, but it's the one I have. And of course, the ones in America, you could buy them, but they had the dinky 10-round mag. What can you do? These were originally created for upcoming police contracts in what was at that time unified Germany again. So they do have a police pedigree. They also achieved some military success, most notably in Poland, but also in Finland. And they would be purchased by a number of police departments, even in the USA and even in Canada. And so this brought Walther kind of back from the brink that the P88. It was modern styling, modern construction, and they brought in some very skilled engineers. But unfortunately, the company was no longer family-owned. This is when the relation with Umrix began. And again, Smith & Wesson had the exclusive to import them. Although I believe Earl's Repair brought some in as well. And there were quite a few versions that started to be introduced around the turn of the millennium. And one of these, the first compact version, came out in 2004, the P99C. You can see it's about a ½ inch shorter, has a 3.5-inch barrel, and it's looked quite a bit lighter at about 18 ounces. This actually makes it a little bit lighter than the main competition at the time, the Glock 26, although it's a slightly larger gun. They also introduced new trigger systems. The original trigger was retroactively renamed the AS trigger, like P99 AS for anti-stress. There was a double action only trigger, introduced really at the insistence of some police departments, including in Germany. And there was the new QA, quick action trigger, which is essentially a Glock trigger. Partially cocked, you might say. Also, like the first version, it has a decocker, so you can have it cocked, and if you need to, uncock it. And that's also good for disassembly. One thing some people hate is having to pull the trigger on a Glock for disassembly. So with this, you could press the decocker and pull it apart. In fact, that was Walther's main reason for doing it. And like we see on a lot of Glocks today, it has the nested 2-spring system for the short slide. And all that good stuff. Here's the short mag. It's 10 shot standard. Interestingly, when they were doing the 10 round mags for the American market on the full size, they took this body and just put an extended base plate on it. They also introduced Generation 2 P99s around this time. And there would be what you might call 1.5 or 2.5 as well. One of the main things, they went to a pick rail with one notch here. They would enlarge the trigger guard a bit. They would get away from what people call the ski hump. If you look under the trigger here, you can see it. It was originally done to kind of made up with that, but some people didn't like it because it pinched their fingers. So they got rid of it with the second generation. Concurrently, they went to an enlarged paddle release. Both the full size and the compact retained the removable back strap. They went to larger slide serrations. Here. They also reshaped the slide release, making it longer and skinnier. And they began offering an ambidextrous version of the slide release. Not as a standard, but it would appear eventually on the PPQ as a standard. And there were a few other tweaks to the design besides that. And I think from here you can kind of see how this turned into the PPQ and PPQC. Sometimes people will just think of these as Generation 3 P99. And while P99s are not imported into America these days, they're still made in Germany because they're very popular in Europe, including in Poland. So there we have the progression of Walther's handguns from the 70s through the 90s. And again, kind of that lost generation in a way. But we really can see the incremental steps to get from here to here. You know, the P4 introduced a safety system that would be carried over. The P5 and P5C really introduced new styling, but still have the same old systems. The P88, they finally do go to higher capacity and finally abandon the lock breech system, the breech block. Funnily enough, at the same time that Beretta was finding very good success with it, but never mind. But they just didn't work out for the various reasons. But what they learned from these were carried over to their polymer-framed cousins. And I would say the P99 has certainly been a success for Walther. Maybe not a runaway success like Glock has experienced. But thanks to these, the PPQ is on the board today, which is really just a Generation 3 P99, to be honest with you. And I like laying stuff out like this, because you can really see how something's not just pulled out of the void. Okay, the Glock was, but most designs are done incrementally. And I've just enjoyed collecting Walthers over the years. This P4 I found during a trip to Houston at a gun shop. The P5, these came in as surplus, about 15 years ago. Before that, they were hard to get, and now they're not easy. The P5C, these are very rare. As I've said in other videos, I found this after looking all over the country, about an hour and a half down the road. This is a commercial one, whereas the P5 is a police one. The P88 here is another police one. This actually Israeli police. This came in through Century, which is mine, has honest wear and character. And likewise, the P88C here came from Century, but it was actually apparently in maybe a German store, or European store, because it came in the old school cardboard box with 2 mags and cleaning rod. But it was funny, the cardboard box had been sun faded in certain areas, so you could tell where it's set in like a window or in the edge of a cabinet. It would have been interesting to see, because I only had this one. It was on an odd lots list. But pretty cool. I like having the P88C. It's still a nice gun. And as I've said many times, the P99, the first time I picked one up around 99, 2000, it just fit my hand so perfectly that I knew I was going to get one that day, and I did. I've had a few over the years, both in 9 and 40, but I really prefer the 9. Less snappy, very reliable, and you can get mags for a lot easier for them. And when the P99C came out, I didn't buy one right away. I bought one in 40, maybe around 2006. Sold it as I was getting out of 40s. And then this one came from a big batch that CD&N had about 10 years ago. They had a ton of P99s and P99Cs for a really good price, like $400, brand new. So that's when I kept a 9mm. And it's a neat little gun. It's a lot like a Glock 26 in most ways, but again, I find it ergonomically suits me better. So yeah, for these vacation videos, since we're only doing one every so often, I'm trying to give you a little more content. Appreciate you hanging out with me. Love to hear anything you'd have to say in the comments, so feel free to do that. And if you'd like to help support the channel, please check out the link to our Patreon page. This is Misha, and also on behalf of Jay, we'll be back very soon to hang out with you next time.